imagine reading a detailed medical chart, right? Like
Right.
for a severed spine or maybe a rotting limb. But then you slowly realize the doctor isn't talking about a physical body at all.
Right.
They're actually diagnosing the exact psychological trauma and, the internal roadblocks that you are dealing with right now.
It's a completely wild shift in perspective.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are unpacking this really fascinating document simply titled Spiritual Healing .pdf. And our mission for this deep dive is to completely shift how we read some of the most famous ancient texts in the world.
Exactly.
We are going to look at the miracles of Jesus, but we're contrasting the physical events with their deeper spiritual metaphors. The goal here is to uncover how these stories, well, they aren't just ancient historical events frozen in time. They're actually deeply practical blueprints for overcoming our own modern personal struggles.
Yeah, and I think the core premise of this text establishes the stakes right away. I mean, if we read these stories purely as acts of raw power or, ancient medical intervention, we severely limit them. We trap them in the past.
Right, because they just become history lessons.
Exactly. If Jesus is primarily this divine physician correcting biological malfunctions just to prove his authority to people 2,000 years ago,
Yeah.
then the relevance to you sitting in traffic right now is practically zero.
Yeah.
But when you view them through the lens of spiritual healing, suddenly these physical ailments become intricate metaphors for the universal human condition.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading these stories merely as physical healings, it's kind of like reading a recipe just to learn about the chemical reactions of baking.
Ah, that's a good way to put it.
Like you're analyzing the exact temperature at which sugar caramelizes, but you are completely missing the fact that you're actually supposed to eat the cake.
You completely miss the nourishment.
Exactly. So, to get to the cake, the document examines the most common physical limitations described in these ancient texts and mirrors them against our own internal lives. And the text begins with blindness.
Right, and the contrast between the physical and spiritual perspectives here is just stark. I mean, physically, fixing a non-functioning optic nerve or a clouded cornea, that's an incredible act of compassion. It restores a marginalized individual's ability to navigate society, find work, all of that.
Sure.
But spiritually, the text argues that blindness represents spiritual ignorance. It's an inability to perceive ultimate reality. So the healing, therefore, isn't just an optical repair. It's an awakening.
Wow.
It's this movement from the darkness of self-delusion or maybe cultural conditioning into the light of divine truth. In this specific framework, true sight has absolutely nothing to do with physical eyes.
Okay, I do have to push back on that, though. Because physical blindness was, and obviously still is, a devastating literal reality for people. So doesn't turning a person's literal physical disability into a metaphor for, like, being stubborn and ignorant, doesn't that feel a bit reductive? Or even maybe insensitive to the actual suffering of the person in the story?
No, it's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And it's one of the source material actually addresses by looking at how ancient readers understood text. It's not an either-or scenario. It's a both-and.
Both and. Okay.
Yeah, the text argues that the ancient writers weren't erasing the physical suffering. They were elevating it. The physical healing was a real event that proved authority, but the writers recorded it specifically because the physical limitation perfectly mirrored a universal spiritual limitation,
Oh, I see.
right? Because if the story is only about a physical healing in the first century, well, it helps one person. But if that physical reality is also a metaphor for the stubbornness of the human ego, it offers a cure for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the text points out something fascinating. The religious leaders of the time, the people who loudly claimed to see and understand how the world worked, they were the ones the narrative portrays as entirely blind to the truth standing right in front of them.
Right. Well, the physically blind men are the ones who truly recognize reality.
Exactly.
So the people who are absolutely certain they have the world figured out are actually the ones walking around in the dark. I mean, realizing that requires a complete reconstruction of your worldview, which is honestly terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
And now, if blindness is about an inability to perceive reality, the text suggests the immediate consequence of that is an inability to act in reality, basically being frozen. Which brings us to the next section, paralysis.
Right. So physically, we are looking at regenerating withered muscles or mending a spine. Like in that really famous story of the paralyzed man who is let down through a roof by his friends.
Yeah, everyone knows that one.
He is granted instantaneous physical restoration and liberation from a lifetime of dependence. But spiritually, paralysis represents the profound stagnation of the soul.
Stagnation.
Yes, this is about being entirely frozen by guilt, by fear, by trauma, or just by an overwhelming inability to change one's life.
And you see this everywhere today. Like, the modern equivalent of this isn't just physical immobility, it's choice paralysis.
Oh, for sure.
You know, you have someone stuck in a deeply toxic job, or they're frozen in a destructive relationship, or maybe held back by a past failure, and they know they need to move. They can literally see the door, but they are completely paralyzed. They just cannot take the step.
And that is exactly where the text highlights a highly specific detail about the mechanics of this healing. Before Jesus ever addresses the man's paralyzed legs, he addresses the man's internal state. He explicitly says, your sins are forgiven.
Yeah, wait. Why start there? Why address guilt when the guy clearly just wants to walk?
Because the narrative is diagnosing the root cause of the stagnation. Forgiveness, the releasing of internal burden and shame, that is the actual healing.
Wow.
The physical walking that follows is merely the outward symptom that the internal weight has finally been lifted. The text radically shifts the focus from, hey, this figure can fix your body, to unresolved guilt and trauma paralyze the human spirit.
Unresolved guilt paralyzes the spirit.
Yes, you cannot walk into your future if your soul is weighted down by the past.
Yeah.
Spiritual liberation is the absolute prerequisite for forward momentum.
That makes perfect sense. The body can't move if the mind is anchored to a traumatic past. So if paralysis is about being trapped inside your own mind, the text then moves to what happens when you're locked out of your community, like the ultimate social exile. And in the ancient world, nothing represented that quite like leprosy.
No, nothing even came close.
Yeah.
Physically, leprosy is this horrifying, flesh-rotting bacterial disease, and halting that degeneration is a profound medical mercy in itself. But the document emphasizes the sociological reality of leprosy in the ancient Near East. It was the ultimate symbol of defilement. Lepers were legally and religiously required to live entirely outside the camp.
Yeah, completely banished.
If anyone approached them, they literally had to cover their mouths and cry out, unclean, unclean. So spiritually, the text uses leprosy as the ultimate metaphor for deep-seated shame. It represents the alienation and corruption that completely cuts a human being off from connection.
Just the psychological devastation of having to announce your own unworthiness to anyone who comes near you. I mean, that's hard to even fathom. But we do have modern equivalents of this social exile, right?
We definitely do.
Look at the epidemic of modern loneliness, or even the mechanics of cancel culture. When society deems someone unclean today, they are pushed outside the camp. They're totally cut off from the community. And there's a specific action in the source document regarding this healing that really breaks all the rules. When Jesus heals the leper, he reaches out and touches the man before the man is clean.
Yes, that is the pivotal moment of the entire interaction. By defying strict ancient ritual purity laws to make physical contact with an untouchable, the healing fundamentally becomes about the restoration of dignity before the restoration of biology.
That is so powerful.
The touch breaks the social barrier, and then the healing breaks the physical one. It demonstrates that the divine does not wait for humanity to fix itself or sanitize itself before engaging.
It dismantles that totally toxic idea that we have to clean ourselves up or fix all our flaws before we are worthy of connection. The connection is actually what causes the cleansing.
Exactly.
Now, being cut off by social exile is one thing, but what about being cut off by the sheer volume of chaos around you? The text moves from leprosy to the healing of the deaf and mute, specifically pointing to a story set in a region called the Decapolis.
And the setting really matters here. The Decapolis was a network of 10 Greco-Roman cities, so it wasn't some quiet Jewish countryside. It was a bustling, pagan, cosmopolitan center full of conflicting cultures, commerce, and loud competing philosophies.
So noisy.
Very noisy. It is a place of ultimate cultural noise.
Oh.
So physically, healing a deaf and mute man, there is about restoring the mechanics of ears and vocal cords. But spiritually, deafness in these texts is interpreted as an inability to hear any underlying truth amidst the chaos.
Right.
And muteness is the resulting inability to speak truth, to offer praise, or even to advocate for oneself.
So what does this all mean for us? Because the modern parallel here is almost too perfect. You spend an hour doom scrolling, or you sit in an open plan corporate office, and you are just surrounded by an absolute avalanche of noise, outrage, opinions, notifications.
All day long.
We are drowning in information, but completely deaf to anything meaningful. And because of that overload, we experience our own kind of muteness. Think about the anxiety of self-censorship today. You are in a meeting or a social situation and you know something is wrong, but the environment is so overwhelming you literally lose your ability to speak your own truth.
Exactly. You lose your voice because your ears are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And the text provides a very specific mechanism for how this modern condition is healed. In the narrative, Jesus takes the man away from the crowd, sighs deeply, and says an Aramaic word. He says, Ephetha, which translates to be opened,
Wait, why be opened instead of be healed?
because it addresses the walled-up, closed-off defensive posture of a person who is just overwhelmed by noise. The teaching here focuses on spiritual receptivity. We have to learn how to actively quiet the internal and external chaos. Authentic speech requires authentic listening first.
Wow.
You cannot speak words of life, truth, or boundary to others until you have quieted the noise enough to hear that truth yourself.
You literally have to pull away from the crowd to get your voice back.
Right.
Okay, now the text transitions from the breakdown of communication with the outside world to the ultimate breakdown of the self, the chaotic, destructive, internal voices. We are talking about exorcisms, and specifically the story of the Gerasene demoniac. Now, when you read this literally, it is pure cinema. I mean, it's a horror movie. A man living in tombs, screaming day and night, breaking iron chains with supernatural strength, and there's a literal cosmic war with unseen spirits. But how on earth does a supernatural possession story apply to an everyday person's struggle?
Well, if we only view it literally, it doesn't apply to most people. But the source text provides a profound psychological shift here. If we view demonic possession as a spiritual metaphor, it represents a human mind entirely dominated by destructive internal narratives.
Like severe addiction.
Exactly. It is a terrifyingly accurate metaphor for deep-seated addictions, or the feeling of being crushed by systemic generational trauma. When Jesus asks the man his name, the response is, "My name is Legion, for we are many."
Legion. So it's not a single entity. It's a completely fractured identity. I mean, a legion is thousands of soldiers. That is the ultimate picture of a compartmentalized self that has completely shattered under pressure. There's no core identity left, just thousands of competing destructive urges.
Precisely. And the text argues that the true miracle isn't the flashy cosmic battle of casting the spirits into a herd of pigs.
Right, the cinematic part.
Right. The actual miracle, the blueprint for modern readers, is found in the quiet aftermath. The text specifically notes that after the intervention, the townspeople find the man, quote, sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind.
Which is the exact opposite of the chaotic frenzy he was in before.
Exactly. True freedom in this text is the restoration of sanity, self-possession, and a unified identity. It transforms a supernatural horror script into a grounded psychological hope. It demonstrates that no matter how fractured a human mind has become by the forces of chaos or self-destruction, a return to a right mind and a unified self is actually possible.
To sit down, clothed, and in your right mind, I mean, that's the ultimate goal of any therapy or spiritual practice. Now, a massive question arises when we look at all these intricate psychological metaphors. Did the text's author just invent this perspective for a modern audience? Or did the original readers actually view these stories this way?
It's a great question.
And the source document answers this by taking us back to the early church fathers. Specifically, thinkers from the Alexandrian school and later Latin theologians. They realized centuries ago that a purely literal reading of a medical miracle was completely insufficient.
Yes. I mean, think of ancient Alexandria as the intellectual hub of the Mediterranean world. It was a place where Greek philosophy deeply intersected with religious scripture.
Okay.
Scholars there believed that everything in the universe was layered with meaning. If Jesus only healed a few physical bodies in first-century Judea, his impact was historically trapped. But if those healings were prophetic blueprints for how the soul is healed, then the miracles are continually active in every person, in every age.
Right.
One of the masterminds of this approach was Origen of Alexandria around the early 3rd century. He developed the threefold sense of Scripture, arguing texts have a body, a soul, and a spirit. And those correspond to literal, moral, and allegorical meanings.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because our source document has a quote from Origen that perfectly captures the stakes of this framework. He wrote, "For what benefit is it to me if Jesus comes only to the historical Judea and cures physical diseases, unless he also comes to my soul, opens my blind eyes, and heals my spiritual infirmities?" He is demanding that the text be useful right now.
And Origen wasn't just speaking in generalities either. He broke down the mechanics of the metaphors. Let's revisit blindness for a second.
Okay.
In one specific story, Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud with the dirt, and rubs it on the blind man's eyes. Honestly, it sounds like a bizarre, unsanitary, ancient medical practice.
Right, why dirt and spit? I've always wondered about that.
Well, to understand Origen's interpretation, we have to look at the Greek concept of the logos, which represents the divine organizing principle of the universe. The divine reason or word. Origen argued that the spit represents this divine logos coming directly from the mouth of God.
Oh,
And the dirt represents human nature because, humanity was formed from the dust. So the act of making mud is the divine reason intimately mixing with frail human nature.
that is incredible.
When that mixture is applied to the eyes, it grants the human soul the capacity to contemplate God. The bizarre medical act is actually a profound theological statement. Human intellect alone is blind until it is infused with divine wisdom.
The mechanics of that metaphor are just stunning. It's not arbitrary at all. And it gets even deeper when the text brings in Augustine of Hippo, who lived about a century later. Augustine took the story of the paralyzed man, the one let down through the roof, and completely disassembled its symbols.
Augustine's exegesis here is literally a masterclass in allegorical reading. He looks at the two main inanimate objects in the story. The bed the man is paralyzed on, and the roof his friends have to destroy to get him to Jesus. Augustine argues the bed represents our carnal life.
Okay, I have to pause you there. Why does a bed equal a carnal life? What is the logic connecting those two things?
Well, think about the function of a bed. It is where you rest, it's where you seek comfort, and where you are horizontally tied to the earth. Augustine saw the bed as the sum total of our earthly desires, our comforts, and our bad habits. It is the thing that supports our paralysis. We get comfortable in our dysfunction.
Okay, that clicks. We get comfortable in the exact thing that keeps us from moving.
Right.
And what about the roof? Because Augustine says the roof represents the hidden spiritual meaning of the law. How on earth does a roof equal ancient religious law?
Again, you have to look at the function. A roof is a rigid external structure designed to protect the house. In the ancient Jewish mindset, the law, the literal rigid rules of Scripture, was the protective structure over the community. But Augustine is making a radical point here. The literal rigid rules actually keep you separated from the actual source of healing, which is inside the house.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, to get to the truth, to get to the true healing, you literally have to uncover the roof. You have to break through the rigid, literal understanding of the text to reach the spiritual reality underneath.
You literally have to dismantle your rigid beliefs to get healed.
Yes.
And Augustine adds the final piece to this bed metaphor, pointing out the man's state before and after. Before the healing, the bed carries the man. He is entirely supported and controlled by his desires and his habits. But after the healing, Jesus commands him to pick up his bed and walk. Now, the man carries the bed.
It's a complete reversal of power. The bed, the earthly body, and its desires doesn't just vanish. The man still has his humanity, his appetites. But his relationship to them has changed. He is no longer paralyzed by his desires. He's the master of them.
That brings us to the final and perhaps most intense section of our source document. Building on this idea of bad habits and carnal desires, the text maps out the anatomy of a bad habit using the 3 resurrection miracles performed by Jesus.
Yes. For thinkers like Origen and Augustine, these 3 resurrections weren't just Jesus repeating the same magic trick to different crowds. When viewed together, they represent a chillingly accurate, progressive diagnosis of spiritual death. They map the exact stages of how a single toxic thought metastasizes into a life-controlling addiction.
Okay, let's walk through the progression. Stage 1 is the story of Jairus' daughter. If we look at the physical narrative, this young girl has just died. She is still lying in her bed, hidden away inside her house, and Jesus heals her privately inside the room.
Right, and spiritually they view this as sin in the heart. This represents the inception of a destructive desire or a toxic thought. It's just occurred, it's entirely internal, it's private, and it hasn't been acted upon or confessed to anyone.
Just still hidden.
Exactly. And because it's still internal, the text suggests it can be dealt with privately. It can be resurrected in the quiet room of your own conscience through internal reflection.
But if you don't deal with the toxic thought in that private room, it inevitably progresses to stage 2. And this is the story of the widow's son at Nain. Physically, this young man has been dead longer. He is actively being carried in a coffin in a funeral procession outside the city gates. The secret is out.
This is sin in action. The hidden thought from stage 1 has broken out into an overt deed. The destructive behavior is now visible to the community, the bodies outside the house. And that funeral procession represents the gathering momentum of that bad choice.
Right.
To heal this, the text notes that Christ has to physically step in, touch the bier, and halt the procession. It requires an intervention to break the momentum of a habit forming.
Which leads to the final, most severe stage. Stage 3, Lazarus. Physically, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. He is sealed inside a stone tomb, wrapped in burial cloths, and the text specifically notes the grim reality that his body is rotting and smells of decay.
Yeah, this represents sin as habit, or full-blown entrenched addiction. The destructive behavior is no longer a private thought or a single visible action. It is culturally sealed. The soul is completely bound by the burial cloths of vice, isolated in a tomb of its own making.
Oh.
The situation is so deeply decayed that a quiet whisper in a room won't work anymore. The text says it requires a loud, agonizing cry of grace. Lazarus, come out. It takes that to shatter the stone, break the chains, and pull the person back into the land of the living.
It is a terrifying progression, honestly, but ultimately it's an incredibly hopeful one because the text argues that no matter what stage of spiritual death you find yourself in, whether it's a private toxic thought you are harboring, a visible mistake that's gaining momentum, or a deeply entrenched addiction where you feel sealed in a tomb, there is a mechanism for resurrection. There is always a way out.
And that perfectly synthesizes the central paradigm shift this entire document advocates for. The purpose of reading these ancient narratives isn't to look backward through a historical telescope and say, oh, look at what an incredible thing happened for someone else long ago.
The purpose is to hold the text up like a mirror. You read it to ask, look at what is trying to happen inside of me right now. The physical miracle, whether it's opening a blind eye, mending a paralyzed spine, or raising a dead body, is just the calling card. The transformation of your soul is the actual meeting.
Which really leaves us with a profound concept to explore on our own. If Origen and Augustine were right, that focusing entirely on the literal history of these ancient events is a shallow reading that misses the blueprint for human transformation, well, it forces us to examine our own realities.
Yeah, it really does.
How many literal events in our own daily lives, our own physical ailments, our own recurring professional roadblocks, or even our toxic relationship cycles are actually just outward calling cards? How many of these external frustrations are begging us to finally stop and address the invisible fractured spaces inside our own souls?
That is a question that will keep you awake at night. Are your external roadblocks just calling cards for internal healing? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into spiritualhealing.pdf. We hope it helped you break through the roof of your own understanding today. Keep questioning, keep digging, and we'll catch you next time.